February 12, 2021, when the sleepy town of Middleton, Massachusetts, woke up to what would be the beginning of one of the most disturbing cases its inhabitants had ever witnessed. The snow fell lightly on the roofs of the houses, covering the streets with a thin, white layer. Middleton was known for being quiet, a place where people knew their neighbors by name and doors were rarely locked. But that morning, something dark hung in the air. Eleanor Hathaway, a respected and wealthy 70-year-old woman, was an iconic figure in the city. Owner of one of the largest mansions in the region, she came from a long line of successful businessmen and had accumulated a considerable fortune throughout her life. Despite her advanced age, Eleanor was a strong woman, with strong opinions and a strong presence, but in recent years, loneliness had become her constant companion. Widowed for almost a decade, she lived alone in her huge house, with the exception of her faithful maid, Martha, who had been at her service for more than 20 years. That morning, Martha arrived at the mansion around 7:30 a.m., as she did every day. The freezing air bit her face as she climbed the steps that led to the main entrance of the house. She unlocked the heavy wooden door with her usual key, but upon entering, something seemed out of the ordinary. The house was silent, a different silence, a kind of emptiness that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Martha began her daily routine, organizing the kitchen and preparing Eleanor's breakfast. After a while, she noticed that her mistress had not yet come down to breakfast, which was unusual, as Eleanor was a person of strict habits and was always in the dining room at 8 a.m. sharp. Worried, Martha decided to go up to the second floor of the house to check if everything was okay. When he reached the top of the stairs, a chill ran down his spine. Eleanor's bedroom door was ajar. As it slowly approached, something in the air felt off. When she pushed the door all the way open, what she saw made her heart stop for a moment. Eleanor was lying in her bed, but not in the way Martha had expected. The elderly woman's body was motionless, wrapped in sheets, but her expression was marked by fear. There was dried blood on his face and on the pillow. Martha let out a shrill scream that echoed throughout the mansion. His vision blurred for a few moments, but he soon regained control and ran to the nearest telephone. Trembling, she dialed the police number, her hands sweating as she did so. "It's the Hathaway mansion. Please come quickly. Something horrible has happened." Minutes later, police sirens cut through the silence of the quiet streets of Middleton. Curious neighbors peered through the curtains, trying to understand what was happening. The city would soon be gripped by shock and speculation. When police arrived, they found Martha still in shock in the kitchen. She could barely speak, still haunted by the vision of the terrible scene she had witnessed moments before. Detective John Miller, who was leading the investigation, was an experienced man, but even he felt a chill run down his spine when he entered Eleanor Hathaway's room. The atmosphere was heavy, almost suffocating. Something evil had happened there. Miller looked around, analyzing every detail of the scene. The room was in disarray, as if a fight had taken place. However, there were no signs of forced entry, which indicated that whoever the culprit was had entered through the front door, possibly someone Eleanor knew. The elderly woman's body showed clear signs of violence, with marks on her neck that indicated she had been asphyxiated. The mansion, which was once a symbol of prestige and luxury, now became the scene of a dark and terrible mystery. The day had barely started, but the detectives knew they had a long way to go to unravel what had really happened in that house. As news of Eleanor Hathaway's death spread, the small town of Middleton, accustomed to days of tranquility, was plunged into an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty. Who could have committed such an act of violence against such a respected and influential elderly woman? And above all, why? The answers to these questions seemed to be buried deep within the Hathaway family's secrets. And as the investigations began, an even darker truth was about to be revealed. A truth that would involve forbidden love, greed, and a deadly plan that would culminate in the murder of one of the city's most notable figures. The nightmare was just beginning. The clock showed just over 9 a.m. when Detective John Miller, accompanied by his team, began a detailed analysis of the crime scene. The Hathaway mansion, which had once been a symbol of wealth and tradition, now seemed shrouded in an aura of mystery and death. Eleanor Hathaway's body had been carefully removed by coroners, but what she left behind wasn't just an empty mansion. was a series of disturbing questions. Miller, with his many years of experience, knew something was terribly wrong in that house. There were no signs of forced entry, nothing out of place to suggest a robbery. Everything indicated that the killer was someone Eleanor knew, maybe even trusted. It was clear that the crime had not been committed by a stranger. He felt it in his bones. As the forensic team began collecting evidence from Eleanor's room, Miller watched every detail carefully. The first thing that caught his attention was the clutter around the bed. There were objects lying on the floor, such as a broken lamp and a chair that had fallen next to the dressing table. Beside the bed, a bottle of wine was open, with 2 glasses still damp. Miller frowned. Eleanor wasn't known for drinking wine alone, and certainly not in her old age. Who was there with her the night before? Upon taking a closer look at the dresser, Miller noticed something even more disturbing: a broken pearl necklace. The pearls were scattered across the floor, which indicated that there had been a fight, perhaps an attempt at resistance on Eleanor's part. However, the violence did not appear to have been planned. There was a sense of improvisation, of desperation, as if the situation had quickly spiraled out of control. As Miller pondered these details, one of the forensic technicians drew his attention to a small detail that could change the course of the investigation. Under the bed, they found a cell phone, an old flip model that didn't belong to Eleanor. Miller felt a pang of excitement. Phone technology was outdated, but it could contain crucial information. They collected the device's evidence, hoping technicians would be able to recover messages or call logs. Martha, Eleanor's loyal maid, was called to give evidence in the living room. She was visibly shaken, still in shock from what she had witnessed that morning. With shaking hands, she held a cup of tea, but could barely lift it to her lips. Miller knew he would need to be gentle but firm to get the information he needed. "Martha, I know this is really hard, but I need you to tell me everything you remember about last night. Any detail, no matter how small, can help us understand what happened to Ms. Hathaway." Martha took a deep breath, trying to control the tears that threatened to run down her face. "Last night, it was a normal night at first. Mrs. Hathaway had an early dinner, as usual. I helped her up to her room around 8 a.m. She was a little quiet, but she didn't seem worried." Miller paused. "Was she alone during dinner?" Martha hesitated for a moment. "Yes, as far as I know. But after I went up to my room, I heard some footsteps in the hallway. I thought it was Mrs. Hathaway walking through the house, but now, I don't think it was her." "Did you hear voices, Martha? Someone talking to her?" Miller asked, trying to extract more details. "I'm not sure, Detective. The walls are thick, and I was in the servants' room, upstairs. But I think I heard something. Laughter? I'm not sure. I thought I was imagining things." She shook her head, fighting confusion. As Martha continued to provide small fragments of memory, another detective entered the room with a serious expression. "Detective Miller, we found something you might want to see." Miller followed his colleague to Eleanor's office, a room that was rarely used but maintained the same luxury and ostentation as the entire house. In the center of the oak table was an open letter, with words scrawled in hurried handwriting. It was a letter from Sarah Hathaway, Eleanor's daughter, who had been living out of town for the past few years. In the letter, Sarah expressed her frustration with her mother, mentioning recent arguments about a relationship she was experiencing. Eleanor, it seemed, did not approve of Sarah dating a young man much younger than her. The letter ended abruptly, as if Sarah was in the midst of an emotional crisis as she wrote it. Miller began connecting the dots. Sarah Hathaway, the estranged daughter, involved in a controversial relationship with a 19-year-old named Jake Thompson. Eleanor was a woman of means and power, someone who would not hesitate to impose herself on her daughter's life. And now, she was dead. After an argument about that relationship, "We need to find Sarah Hathaway and Jake Thompson immediately," Miller said, his voice firm. "They could be the key to all of this." The case, which had started with an elderly woman dead in her bed, was turning into something much darker. Apparently, Eleanor Hathaway had not died in a simple act of violence. There was something bigger behind it all. Forbidden love, family secrets, and maybe even a plan that had gone horribly wrong. But Miller knew he was just scratching the surface. The real darkness was yet to come. As the investigation continued, discoveries in Eleanor Hathaway's case led Detective John Miller and his team deeper into a tangle of dark secrets. What initially seemed like an isolated murder soon revealed itself to be a dangerous plot involving forbidden passions, greed, and betrayal. The name that now appeared at the center of it all was Sarah Hathaway, the victim's troubled daughter, and her young boyfriend, Jake Thompson, who brought with her an aura of mystery and danger. Jake Thompson was just 19 years old, but he had already lived a life full of turmoil. Coming from a humble family on the other side of town, he was known for being charming and manipulative, someone who knew exactly how to win people over and bend them to his will. With a history of petty crimes and involvement in local gangs, he didn't seem like the type of man that Sarah, a woman in her 40s and heiress to a large fortune, would normally be involved with. However, the passion between the two was intense and, for many, inexplicable. The relationship between Sarah and Jake had begun months before Eleanor's death, under circumstances that no one could have predicted. Sarah, who had spent much of her life trying to live up to her mother's expectations, always felt suffocated by the pressure of being a Hathaway. She had married young, in an arranged marriage that quickly fell apart, leaving her with a deep emotional void. In an attempt to escape her mother's shadow, Sarah became involved in a series of complicated relationships, but none as problematic as her involvement with Jake. Jake was everything Sarah wasn't: young, impulsive, and rebellious. He made her feel alive again, freed her from the shackles of family and social expectations. But at the same time, it also brought with it a series of problems. Jake was much more than just a young, adventurous boyfriend. He had a dark side, a side that Sarah preferred to ignore. Eleanor Hathaway had always been suspicious of Jake. She saw through his superficial charm and knew he was only interested in his family's money. The fights between Eleanor and Sarah over Jake became frequent and heated. Eleanor did everything she could to keep Jake away from her daughter, but with each attempt, Sarah grew even closer to the young man, fueling a kind of belated rebellion that blinded her to Jake's true motives. In early February 2021, tensions between mother and daughter reached a fever pitch. Sarah, desperate to escape her mother's influence, began hatching a plan with Jake. They believed that if they could eliminate Eleanor, the family fortune would be within reach, and together they could start a new life, far from society's rules and judgments. The plan was simple, or so it seemed in their passionate and desperate heads. They decided they would flee to Miami after Eleanor's death. Sarah had already transferred part of her inheritance to a secret account and bought plane tickets. What remained was the final act: removing Eleanor from the scene. On February 11th, 2021, the night before the murder, Sarah and Jake met at a motel on the outskirts of Middleton to discuss the final details of the plan. Sarah was nervous, but Jake reassured her, promising that everything would work out and that they would finally be free to live as they wanted. The young man was confident, certain that Eleanor's death would just be an obstacle to be overcome before achieving the life of luxury he so desired. But things didn't go as planned. That same night, Sarah returned to the mansion and found her mother in her room as usual. The atmosphere was tense. Eleanor was not naive. She knew Sarah was up to something, although she wasn't sure what exactly. The two began arguing again, this time about Sarah's relationship with Jake. Eleanor, furious, threatened to disinherit her daughter if she continued to get involved with that tramp who only wanted the family's money. Eleanor's words hit Sarah like a blow, but her mind was already made up. Sarah called Jake, who was waiting outside the house. She let him in discreetly, and together, they confronted Eleanor for the last time. Jake, initially, just intended to scare the elderly woman, perhaps forcing her to sign some documents that would guarantee Sarah's fortune. But Eleanor was not intimidated. She faced Jake with the same defiant look she used when handling the family business, and it was then that something clicked inside him. The situation quickly spiraled out of control. In a fit of fury, Jake grabbed Eleanor by the neck. Sarah watched, transfixed, as her mother's life slowly slipped away. What should have been a simple threat turned into a brutal murder. When it was all over, Eleanor was dead in bed, and Sarah and Jake sat there in silence, shocked by what they had just done. It wasn't how they had imagined. There was no glamour or relief, just a feeling of emptiness and regret. They knew they needed to act quickly. The escape plan for Miami was still on, but now it involved much more than just escaping Eleanor's clutches. They were running away from a crime. Cleaning up the evidence as best they could, the two left the mansion before dawn, intending never to look back. But secrets don't stay buried forever. And the dangerous romance between Sarah Hathaway and Jake Thompson would soon become their undoing, as the investigation progressed and new revelations came to light. The morning after the crime, while the town of Middleton was still trying to understand what had happened at the Hathaway mansion, Detective John Miller was more determined than ever to solve the case. Each clue was leading to a clearer, but also darker path. Sarah Hathaway's name was now a constant shadow in the investigation, and Miller knew that if he wanted answers, he would have to find her, and fast. After analyzing the cell phone found at the crime scene, forensic technicians were able to recover messages exchanged between Sarah and Jake in the days before the murder. The conversations were worrying, full of tension and, in some parts, quite explicit about the contempt they both felt for Eleanor. There were mentions of a new life in Miami and a plan to work things out once and for all. The evidence was clear. Sarah and Jake were involved in the murder. Miller organized a search to find the couple. They had fled, but they were not invisible. Sarah had made a mistake when she used her mother's credit card to book plane tickets to Miami. This small clue was enough to put police on alert at airports across the country. Within hours, Miller's team learned that Sarah and Jake had been spotted at a cheap hotel near Miami International Airport. They were both desperate. The promises of a life of luxury and freedom turned into a harrowing race to escape prison. The glamour that Jake had promised was a far cry from the reality they lived in now, hiding in a dirty room, with no money and no way out. They knew the siege was closing. As Miller and his team prepared for the capture operation, Sarah was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. She spent hours sitting on her hotel bed, staring at her phone, waiting for a magical solution that would never come. Jake, on the other hand, was restless, pacing the small room, desperately trying to think of a plan to get out of the situation. Finally, on the night of February 13th, 2021, 2 days after the murder, authorities arrived at the hotel. The SWAT team surrounded the building, ensuring there was no escape. Detective Miller was on the front lines, watching with watchful eyes as the situation unfolded. When the police burst into the room, Sarah was sitting on the edge of the bed, her eyes glazed over and a lost look in her eyes. Jake, however, tried to resist. He wielded a knife, threatening anyone who approached, but was soon restrained. The fight ended almost as quickly as it started, and Jake was handcuffed and taken into custody. Sarah didn't say a word as she was taken to the squad car. His face was pale, his eyes staring blankly, as if he had finally understood the weight of what he had done. Her entire life, the promises of freedom, the revolt against her mother, the dangerous romance with Jake, were now nothing more than an illusion destroyed by the cruel reality she had constructed. During the interrogation, Jake was the first to speak. Under pressure, he began to break down, admitting his role in Eleanor Hathaway's murder. He tried to justify his actions, claiming that it was Sarah who influenced him to commit the crime. She, according to him, was desperate for freedom and believed that eliminating her mother was the only way. Sarah, on the other hand, was harder to crack. During hours of interrogation, she remained silent, refusing to admit any involvement. But the facts were against her. The messages, the escape plans, the troubled relationship with his mother. Everything pointed to his guilt. As the days went by, and as the pressure grew, Sarah finally gave in. In a cold, emotionless confession, she admitted that she had planned the murder with Jake. However, she insisted she never imagined things would escalate to the point of violence. For her, the plan was just a way to scare her mother, to force her to let her live her life with Jake. But once things got out of hand, there was no turning back. The trial of Sarah Hathaway and Jake Thompson was one of the most talked about at the time. The media covered every detail, from the couple's twisted motivations to the emotional testimonies from friends and family. Audiences were fascinated by the story, the fall of a powerful family and the tragedy of a romance that led to the brutal murder of a matriarch. In the end, Sarah and Jake were convicted of first-degree murder. Sarah received a life sentence without the possibility of parole, while Jake, due to his cooperation in the case, received a 25-year sentence. Both would spend the rest of their lives behind bars, paying the price for their impulsive and tragic choices. For Detective Miller, the Hathaway case was never just about the murder of a rich woman. It was about what desperation and greed could do to people, about how love could be twisted until it became a deadly weapon. Ultimately, the truth came out, but not without leaving a trail of pain and destruction. And so, the name Hathaway, once synonymous with power and prestige, was forever marked as a dark reminder of how far one can go when secrets and lies are carried for too long. The trial of Sarah Hathaway and Jake Thompson was one of the most intense the city of Middleton had ever seen. The weeks that followed were filled with sensational headlines and speculation about the couple's fate. The case turned into a media circus. Reporters camped out in front of the courthouse, cameras capturing Sarah and Jake's every expression, every word as their lives publicly fell apart. In court, the prosecution painted a devastating picture of Sarah and Jake. They were portrayed as predators who had coldly plotted Eleanor Hathaway's murder out of greed and ambition. The prosecution brought messages, testimonies from friends, and even financial records that showed how Sarah was moving inheritance money before her mother's death. The defense lawyer tried, in vain, to claim that Sarah had been manipulated by Jake, a vulnerable and emotionally fragile woman who was drawn into a deadly plan by a cunning young man. The verdict was unanimous. In late March 2021, the jury found Sarah Hathaway guilty of first-degree murder. Jake Thompson, who had cooperated with the investigation, was also convicted, although his sentence was reduced in exchange for his cooperation. Sarah, however, was not so lucky. The judge sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The name Hathaway, once synonymous with wealth and status, was now associated with betrayal and tragedy. Inside the courtroom, the mood was somber. Sarah showed no emotion upon hearing her sentence, keeping her gaze fixed on the ground. Jake, on the other side, appeared to be in a state of shock, even though the deal he had made with the authorities guaranteed that he would not spend the rest of his days behind bars. However, any sense of victory was quickly replaced by the bitterness of a life lost. For Detective John Miller, the case was about more than just solving a crime. It was a dark reminder of human nature and what people are capable of when motivated by desperation and greed. He had spent weeks delving into the family's most sordid details, and now, with the trial over, Miller felt like something had closed inside him too. Maybe it was the weight of truth. The realization that sometimes even those who seem to have it all are capable of destroying their own lives and the lives of others. After the verdict, Middleton slowly returned to normal, but the scars of the Hathaway case would remain in the city's memory for a long time. The mansion, which was once a symbol of power and prestige, was now empty and desolate. Nobody wanted to live there. They didn't even go near the place at night. Rumors began to circulate that the house was haunted by the spirit of Eleanor, a woman who was brutally taken from her own life by those who should have loved her. Jake was transferred to a medium security prison, where he would serve his 25-year sentence. For the first few months, he tried to adapt to life behind bars, but it soon became clear that he would never completely escape the shadow of his crimes. Inside prison, he became just another name in a long list of men who had made bad decisions and were now paying the price for their choices. Sarah, on the other hand, was isolated from the outside world. Life in prison meant she would never see freedom again, and in some ways, perhaps it was a relief for her. The weight of guilt and shame was crushing, and in the months following her conviction, Sarah retreated deeper into herself. She rarely received visitors, and the few friends she had left slowly drifted away. However, the most painful outcome was for those Eleanor had left behind. The Hathaway family fortune has been diluted by lawsuits and hidden debts. The name Hathaway, once associated with power and respect, was now a reminder of a tragedy. The legacy of Eleanor, a woman who had built an empire with her own hands, was forever tarnished by those she loved most. The town of Middleton, as time passed, began to heal. People stopped talking about the Hathaway case, and the news turned to new scandals and tragedies. However, the town's elders still remembered the night the Hathaway mansion became the scene of one of the most shocking crimes Middleton had ever seen. And so, the Hathaway case came to an end. A tragic outcome for all involved, a reminder that, Behind closed doors, appearances can be deceiving, and dark secrets can lurk in even the most seemingly perfect families. For John Miller, the detective who cracked the case, there was a strange relief in finally seeing justice done. But there was also an emptiness, an understanding that, despite everything, no one really emerged victorious from this story. Everyone lost something. Eleanor Hathaway's death was the end of an era and the beginning of a scar that would never completely heal, not in the town of Middleton, nor in the hearts of those involved. The Hathaway case may have been closed in court, but the memories, secrets, and horror of that crime would continue to haunt those who lived through it forever.